these other colonies. This was a huge world war that took place, but these were just the strongest powers that we're talking about. France and Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. These were the main combatants during this war. Now, what started the 7 Years' War? Well, there are several things. And let's start with the European front, because there was something that took place in the American continent that caused it. But let's start off with what happened in Britain, in Europe rather. So, what happened is war broke out between France and Britain in the New World, and at the same time, Frederick II, who was from Prussia, he decided he wanted to take some of Austria's territory. Now, Austria is directly south of Prussia. You can see that. It's the second blue bubble on the map. He decided he wanted to take more territory from the Austrians. And so he decided to launch south, but he didn't think France was actually going to get in on the war. Turned out he was incredibly wrong. France joined with Austria, which was a huge change in foreign policy for France, because France never went to war with Austria. They always went to war against Austria, but they were never on the same side of a fight. That's why Frederick II of Prussia thought that France was going to stay out of it. The problem was France was more concerned about Prussian advancing than they were Austrian advancing. So France begins to join in a huge shift to foreign policy. They begin to join forces with Austria, and that causes a huge power struggle. After Prussia gets into war with Austria, England is worried about France and Austria being on the same side of the war, so they jump in. And then you have some of the Netherlands kicking in, and you have all of these nations kicking in. Finally, Russia kicks in. This is called in history, and this is on 355, and I didn't have you write this down, but this radical change in alliances was called the Diplomatic Revolution. Again, France and Austria did not go to war with each other. They always went to war against each other, but they didn't go to war with each other. This was a huge change in foreign policy. Now, inside England, because now England is one of the biggest parties involved, inside England, there was a guy that named William Pitt that really decided he was going to put forth a policy on how to beat France, Austria, and Russia. Before we get to him, we need to go back to what the war was like in America. In the American continents, the French and the English both had huge holdings in the American continent. You had the 13 colonies that were English, and then you had west of the 13 colonies, you had west of the Mississippi, that was all French controlled. You had Canada, which was under French control. French holding in the American colonies were major concerns for the British. And because of this, we see something through the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War has been known as a staging ground for the American Revolution. Why? Because so many of the people you see in the French and Indian War showed up in the French and Indian War. One of the most important players was a guy by the name of George Washington. Now, George Washington, he was the man that really started the French and Indian War in earnest. Again, everything that was going on in Europe, that was slowly mounting, but George Washington was the powder keg that lit and blew the whole thing up. George Washington, who was a colonel of British forces in Virginia, was sent by the Virginia governor to, by the way, the Virginia governor's name was Dinwiddie. You think that's a funny name? Dinwiddie is quite a name. Dinwiddie sends Washington up to Ohio to throw the French out of the Ohio Valley. At the very least, he's supposed to be reconnaissance. Washington gets up into the Ohio Valley, and he sees a French platoon, and really without any thought to what could happen. And I love George Washington. I don't mean this to come across as unfeeling towards the guy, but he just doesn't think, and he just unloads on the French. And this French column had a whole lot more with them than Washington did. Washington had to retreat, and he created a makeshift fort named Fort Wilderness, and he attempted to beat the French. The French beat him, and amazingly the French let him go. And I view this as an act of providence, because the French let him go, and after the French let him go, he went back to Virginia, and basically that's what started the French and Indian War in earnest. And this is why the French and Indian War is a huge staging ground for the American Revolution. Now, remember that guy I told you about? The guy that created the strategy for Britain and how they were going to win this war. His name was William Pitt. William Pitt was a British statesman, and this was basically his strategy for winning the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. This is what it was. He decided that as Britain stood a chance to win in the New World, he decided to commit supply to Prussia financially. He was going to supply Prussia with financial aid to help fight the French in Europe. Meanwhile, Britain was going to spend a whole lot more attention in the New World, where the French had the most of their holdings, and he was going to make sure that they could keep the French naval power to a minimum, because the British had the best navy in the world at the time. So he said, let's all play within our strengths. We're across the English Channel. There's really no way we can fight France. We can, but it's not the best use of our resources. Here, Prussia, you have all the aid you need. You go after France. You keep them in their place. We'll send our ships into the Channel, and we'll make sure that the French can't send any support. We'll make sure the French supply lines are cut. We'll go over to the New World, and we'll make sure that the French are in the New World. Prussia, you keep an eye on the Eastern Front. And theoretically, that should have worked. Except, it didn't, obviously. What happened was this. Frederick II of Prussia decided he was going to try to take some of these other some of these other territories around him, and he bites off more than he can chew. Before long, he begins to realize he has invaded the neighboring kingdom of Saxony, and he soon found himself surrounded by enemies. Russia, Sweden, and the German states and Spain had all joined France and Austria in opposition to Prussia. Again, this is why I say this war was really the first World War. It wasn't World War I that happened in 1918. It was the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, whatever you want to call it. This was the first real world war, because most of Europe was at war at this point. And Frederick II, he did not have the ability to fight on all these fronts. England had the easy job. He had the hard job. He found himself surrounded by enemies on all sides. And even though at first his army was superior, it wasn't enough, because his opponents outnumbered him. He was able to keep them at bay only for so long. Eventually, he saw that there was no chance he could win the war. And what happens is he turns around, and before he turns around, he realizes Britain has done so well in the New World that pretty much the New World is, there's really no contest at this point. And Britain has got a new monarch, and that new monarch is known as James III. Now, I think I said James III. It was George III. George III is important because he would be the same king that was in control during the American Revolution in the future. But George III becomes king, and he cuts off subsidies to Prussia. Prussia has been given money all these years by the British, and the British have cut off the spigot of their money. And now he realizes he's fishing without a net here. Because Britain has said, okay, we can kind of do this by ourselves, Prussia. Thanks for the help. Thanks for being our meat shield. But we're going to let you do your own thing now. And he's cut without really much of anything. And when you are in this situation, what can you do except sue for peace? Because there's no way he's going to win this. So what he does is he sues for peace in what's called the Hubertsburg Treaty. The Treaty of Hubertsburg, that ended up ending hostilities in Europe. So basically, Frederick II of Prussia drops out of the war. When he drops out of the war, Russia drops out of the war. Basically, it becomes a three-person fight. And the three-person fight is France and Britain and Spain. Now, Spain wasn't one of those main powers I told you about earlier, but they were one of those powers. Again, this is a world conflict at this point. Those are the only three combatants left. And most of this is being fought in the New World. Eventually, though, in that same year, hostilities would even be ended in the North American continent. Because what you had next was the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris settled all final hostilities between the major powers. So basically, this is the nail in the coffin for France. And quite honestly and quite frankly, this is what made France lose its place as a world leader. Because after this, France would go into financial debt because they lost this war. They would go into financial debt. And then the next king of France would ally himself with the Americans in the American Revolution, and we thank him for that, but at the same time, he further bankrupted his country, and eventually, within a couple of years after the end of the American Revolution, the French king was thrown off the throne, lost his head, and went into the French Revolution, which was a long and bloody time in world history, and France would not come off the mat until Napoleon. And this was the beginning of the end for France. But the Treaty of Paris, that's what settled all the final hostility between the major powers altogether. And these were some of the demands that took place. Number one, France had to lose all territory in North America. Now, eventually, that was the plan. It eventually would let me explain. I'll explain that in a second. France lost all territory in North America. Britain gained all of Canada and all land east of the Mississippi. Now you notice here, the note says all of Canada and land east of the Mississippi. So let me go back here. I want to go back to this map here, and I want to show you east of the Mississippi. Okay. All right. So right here you've got the Mississippi River. Right here you've got the 13 colonies. Everything in between is what was lost by France at the end of the war. They were allowed to keep this portion over here, which is known as the Louisiana Territory. That would eventually be given over to the Americans after the American Revolution. But again, the idea was they were supposed to give up all land in North America. That's not what happened, but that's what was supposed to happen. So first of all, after they gave up all that land, France was supposed to lose all commercial holdings in India. And finally, Spain would lose Florida to Britain. However, and I didn't write this down because it's not that important to what you need to know for the test, but Spain was allowed to get some portions of the New World from France. So Spain didn't do as poorly in this out as France did. France just got their head handed to them, basically. So, after all of this, we've got one more note that's important. After all this has taken place, you've got Poland. Now, you look in your book on page 357, you see a map, and you see what Poland looks like.